from the east. And the final leg of that journey takes him over the crest of the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is right next to Mount Zion. The Kidron Valley runs between them. The Mount of Olives is actually slightly taller than Mount Zion. And so from the crest of the Mount of Olives, you are looking over the city of Jerusalem. And in the city of Jerusalem, you could look up and see what's happening at the top of the Mount of Olives. That's interesting that this is how Jesus chooses to come into the city, because we'll find out in a couple of days he's going to be on that Mount of Olives again preaching what we call the Olivet Discourse about the end times. It's going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane that is on the side of the Mount of Olives that Jesus is going to be arrested. In a little over a month, he's going to be standing at the top of this same Mount of Olives, and it's from there that he's going to ascend into heaven in the sight of his disciples. And in fact, the prophet Zechariah, we're not ready to turn to him yet. The prophet Zechariah tells us that in the future, when the Lord Jesus returns, his precious feet are going to land at the top of that Mount of Olives. But today, the day in our text, doesn't look anything like that. Just imagine for a moment that you are standing in the busy streets of Jerusalem. It is swelled with all of these travelers who have come for Passover, and you start to notice that something has got everybody's attention, right? More and more people are stopping and they're staring off into the distance. They're facing to the east, looking up at that crest of the Mount of Olives, because there is an obvious commotion going on out there. There is a much bigger than normal crowd out there, and they're moving along slowly, and they're creating a disturbance. And you can even see, weaving through that crowd, a solitary figure descending from the top of the mountain down into the valley, preparing to come into the city of Jerusalem. If you can imagine that, what you would be witnessing through the words of this text is an event that would become known to history as the triumphal entry. When Jesus enters into Jerusalem to the shouts and sounds of praise. And if you are in your imagination there on the streets, then it's your own curiosity that's getting described there in verse 10. All the city was moved, saying, "Who is this?" Now there is an abundance of answers to that question. Who is this? Well, for some, they hope it's Jesus, a political dissenter. Many were willing to accept Jesus as Messiah as long as he was willing to come into power and form a military and boot out the occupying army of the Romans. But as Jesus comes into the city in this week, one of the first things he does is goes into the temple and cleanses the temple. He is more concerned with confronting religious hypocrisy than he is dethroning political powers. So who is this? For the religious establishment, Jesus is just an unauthorized and self-proclaimed rabbi. He has no credentials, he has no education, he does not have their permission, and therefore he has absolutely no right to be teaching in opposition to their established traditions. And during this week, Jesus is going to challenge their authority, calling them hypocrites and blind guides in the face of the entire crowd, leaving them in stunned silence. Who is this? Well, for a lot of the crowd, Jesus is just the traveling healing show. Down in verse 14, we'll find that even in the temple, under the nose of the Romans and Jewish authorities, Jesus was ready, willing, and able to heal the blind and the lame, but the healing ministry of Jesus was not an end. The healing ministry of Jesus was a means to an end. Jesus engaged in this healing ministry throughout his time out of compassion and in order to authenticate his message of salvation. Anybody who was there just to see the show was entirely missing the point. Who is this? Well, the majority of people around him say in verse 11 of our text, this is Jesus, the prophet of Nazareth. That sounds better, right? In many ways, it is better. But Matthew, if you remember, has already recorded for us that this declaration is entirely deficient. Back in Matthew 16, when Jesus said, "Who do men say that I am?" The answer of, well, here's what everybody says you are. Some say you're John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say Jeremiah or some other prophet. What was the only blessed answer? Who do you say that I am? You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Whoever it is over there, the uproar that's happening on one mountain makes its way to the other mountain. And the city, in verse 10, it says, was moved. That word moved translates the Greek verb where we get our word seismic. The idea is the city is shaken to its core by this event. What is this disturbance all about? Who is this man coming over the crest of the Mount of Olives? And he's riding a young donkey and he's being praised by the crowd as he enters the gates of Jerusalem. Most of the people, I think it's clear, most of the people have their ideas, they have their opinions, but they simply do not know. They do not grasp what it is that they're seeing in front of them. But I wonder, and this is me using some sanctified imagination, I wonder if that crowd who wonders who he is and doesn't know for sure started humming the tune to Psalm 24 in their minds and not really knowing why. As they lift up their heads toward the crest of the Mount of Olives, as they open the doors of the city, as Jesus victoriously enters the gates of Jerusalem, and they ask, "Who is this?" I wonder if the tune to Psalm 24 is in their minds, because here's what part of that psalm says. "Lift up your heads, O you gates, and be lifted up, you everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in." Who is this King of glory? The Lord, mighty and strong, the Lord, mighty in battle. Lift up your head, O you gates, lift up, you everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. Who is Jesus? Y'all, Jesus is King. Jesus is the Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. In verse 1 through 3, we'll see he is the sovereign king. In verses 4 through 6, he is the victorious king. In verse 7 through 11, he is the rightful king. Let's see verse 1 through 3 first. Jesus is the sovereign king. From the crowd's perspective, this triumphal entry was a spontaneous event. The multitude was just getting caught up in the moment and doing what felt right. They were doing what came to mind. From Matthew's perspective, the triumphal entry was a product of sovereign planning. Start at verse 1 again. "Now when they drew near Jerusalem and came to Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, 'Go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Loose them and bring them to me. And if anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord has need of them, and immediately he will send them.'" Just over If you're thinking of it from Jerusalem, just over the crest of the Mount of Olives, there are two small villages, Bethany and Bethpage. You'll see Bethany mentioned in verse 17 later. Bethany is the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. It's a common place for Jesus to stay as he comes in and out of the city of Jerusalem. But on this day, Jesus determines to pass through Bethpage. This is a different choice than the disciples probably would have expected, but